Have you ever pondered the promises made and the hopes ignited by the ascent of Barack Obama, the first black president of the United States? Were you left disillusioned as the years unfolded, revealing a reality that fell short of expectations? Behold, beyond the veneer of historic symbolism lies a narrative of unmet aspirations and shattered dreams within the black community. Lest you wonder if Obama's presidency truly represented the interests of black Americans, let it be known unequivocally that the truth unveils a different tale. His tenure transcended mere political milestones. It became a crucible of unaddressed systemic inequities and broken promises, sparking fervent discourse within the realms of black culture and identity. Attend closely, esteemed readers, for today you shall delve into the complexities of Obama's legacy and the unresolved challenges facing black America. Before we continue, kindly endeavor to hit that like button as a way of supporting our work. Share with your families and friends to keep spreading our eye-opening black narrative. And subscribe to stay put for more while you help in building the rising membership of this channel. We appreciate your support. I was born in the midst of the civil rights movement, a time when hope and change were tangible concepts for black people in America. My parents, like many others, believed that one day, a black president would lead our nation, bringing about true equality and justice for all. And then, in 2008, that dream became a reality with the election of Barack Obama. As a young black man, I was filled with optimism and pride, believing that finally, our voices would be heard and our struggles would be acknowledged. But as the years passed, I began to see how Obama, the first black president, failed and ultimately betrayed his own people. At first, I was blinded by his charisma and eloquence. It was refreshing to see a black man in the highest position of power, and I was convinced that he would use his platform to address the issues plaguing the black community. But as time went on, I saw how his promises of change were nothing more than empty rhetoric. Instead of advocating for the rights and needs of black people, he catered to the interests of the wealthy and ignored the systemic racism that was still prevalent in our society. One of the biggest disappointments for the black community was Obama's failure to address systemic racism and its far-reaching effects. While he acknowledged the issue in his speeches, he did little to actually combat it. Many felt that he was too concerned with appeasing the powerful and wealthy rather than standing up for the marginalized and oppressed. The cracks in Obama's facade began to show during the Black Lives Matter movement. As protests erupted across the country in response to police brutality and the unjust treatment of black people, Obama's response was lukewarm at best. He condemned the violence but failed to address the root causes of it. He also ignored the calls for police reform, choosing instead to defend law enforcement and their tactics. The black community felt betrayed by Obama's lack of action. They had put their faith in him, believing that he would be their voice in the White House. But as the years passed by, it became increasingly clear that Obama was not the president they had hoped for. It wasn't just his inaction on issues of racial justice that angered the black community. Many also felt that Obama's economic policies favored the wealthy and did little to help the working class and people of color. Despite his promises to close the income gap and provide equal opportunities, the gap between the rich and poor continued to widen under his presidency. The suspicions and frustrations of the black community finally came to a head during the 2016 presidential election. Many African Americans chose not to vote for Hillary Clinton, Obama's chosen successor, as they no longer believed in the promises of the Democratic Party. They had been let down by Obama and were unwilling to put their trust in another candidate who they felt did not truly have their best interests at heart. When Obama left office in 2017, the black community was left with a feeling of disillusionment and disappointment. They had hoped for so much more from the first black president, but in the end, he had failed to deliver on his promises. It wasn't until several years later, when Obama began his post-presidency tour and started to speak candidly about his time in the White House, that the truth began to come to light. In interviews and speeches, he admitted to his failures and shortcomings, but also pointed out the obstacles he faced in enacting real change. As I stand here before you today, I cannot help but reflect on my time in the White House. It was a privilege and honor to serve as the 44th President of the United States. But it was also one of the most challenging and humbling experiences of my life. It wasn't until several years after my presidency ended, when I started my post-presidency tour, that I truly began to speak candidly about my time in office. And let me tell you, it was not easy to open up and admit to my failures and shortcomings. But I knew that in order to continue to serve my country, I had to be honest with myself and with the people who supported me. One of the greatest challenges I faced during my time in the White House was trying to bring about real change. When I first took office, I was filled with hope and optimism. I believed that with my background and my vision, I could make a difference and make the world a better place for all Americans. But as I quickly realized, the reality of governing was far more complicated than I could have ever imagined. There were many obstacles that stood in the way of enacting real change. One of the biggest challenges was the political climate in Washington. Congress was deeply divided, and the two parties were at odds on almost every issue. This made it incredibly difficult to pass any legislation, let alone make any meaningful progress. Obama spoke about the resistance he faced from Congress and the pressure from special interest groups. He acknowledged that he had to make compromises and sacrifices in order to push any legislation through. But the challenges didn't end there. I also faced resistance from special interest groups and lobbyists who fought against any changes that threatened the status quo. Their influence and power in Washington often outweighed the needs and concerns of the American people. It was disheartening to see how much money and influence could determine the fate of policies that impacted millions of lives. Furthermore, the media played a significant role in creating obstacles as well. With the rise of social media and 24-hour news cycles, sensationalism and controversy became the norm. It seemed that the more outrageous the headline, the more attention it received. This made it difficult for me to have meaningful conversations and discussions about important issues with the American people, as the media was more focused on creating drama and fueling divisive narratives. But perhaps the biggest obstacle I encountered during my presidency was my own inexperience and naivety. I thought that my academic background and my ideals would be enough to navigate the complex world of politics and governing. However, I quickly learned that there is no textbook or class that can fully prepare you for the reality of being the President of the United States. It was a constant learning process, and I made mistakes along the way. I didn't always make the right decisions, and I am not afraid to admit that. Looking back, there are certainly things that I would have done differently. But as I have said before, decision-making at the highest level is often about choosing the best among imperfect options. And sometimes, in the face of relentless opposition and resistance, the only option is to compromise. One of the biggest criticisms I faced during my presidency was my response to the financial crisis in 2008. Many felt that I didn't do enough to hold the banks and financial institutions accountable for their role in the crisis. And while I admit that I could have taken more aggressive action, the reality was that the economy was in dire straits, and we needed to act quickly to prevent a complete collapse. But I also want to address the failures and shortcomings that I am most ashamed of during my time in office: the failure to close Guantanamo Bay and the escalation of drone strikes. These were decisions that I made, and in hindsight, I can see that they were not the best choices. They went against the core values and principles that I believed in, and I take full responsibility for them. However, I also want to point out that being president is not a one-person job. I had a team of advisors, experts, and staff that I relied on heavily for their advice and guidance. And while the ultimate decision rested on my shoulders, I could not have accomplished anything without their support and hard work. As I look back on my time in the White House, I am reminded of a quote by President Theodore Roosevelt. "It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming. But who does actually strive to do the deeds? Who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions? Who spends himself in a worthy cause? Who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement? And who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat. So, my fellow Americans, I stand before you today as a man who dared greatly. I may not have succeeded in all my goals, but I have no regrets about the time I spent in office. I believe that we must continue to strive for progress and never lose sight of the values and principles that make this country great. Thank you. But for the Black community, these explanations were not enough. They couldn't help but feel that Obama had abandoned them in favor of appeasing the wealthy and powerful. His failure to address police brutality, mass incarceration, and economic inequality were glaring signs of his betrayal. Time and time again, I watched as he remained silent or offered half-hearted solutions while Black men and women continued to suffer at the hands of a broken system. I remember the day when Trayvon Martin, a 17-year-old Black boy, was shot and killed by a white neighborhood watch volunteer. The nation was in an uproar, demanding justice for this innocent young man. I expected Obama, as a father and a Black man, to speak out against this injustice and demand accountability. But instead, he gave a vague and dismissive statement, saying that if he had a son, he would look like Trayvon. Those words felt hollow and did nothing to address the deep-rooted issue of racial profiling and violence against Black people. And as more similar cases of unarmed Black people being killed by police emerged, I waited for Obama to take a stand and use his influence and power to bring about real change. But time after time, I was disappointed by his lack of action and leadership. He would offer condolences and attend funerals, but his words felt empty without any concrete steps towards ending police brutality. His silence on the Black Lives Matter movement spoke volumes. While he was quick to condemn violence against police officers, he failed to acknowledge the systemic racism that led to the creation of this movement. It was a slap in the face to the Black community, a clear indication that our struggles were not a priority for our first Black president. And as the years went on, I saw how Obama's economic policies also failed to uplift the Black community. Despite his promises of creating jobs and improving the economy, the wealth gap between Black and white Americans only continued to widen. The unemployment rate for Black people remained almost twice as high as that of white people, and the racial wealth gap grew even wider. While the stock market soared and corporate profits reached record highs, many Black families struggled to make ends meet. Jobs were created, but they often offered low wages and lacked stability, leaving Black workers disproportionately vulnerable to economic downturns. As I witnessed the persistent struggles of the Black community, I started to question whether Obama's promises were just empty words, designed to give the illusion of progress. I felt that the Black community was being used as a pawn in the game of politics. Despite his historic presidency and rhetoric of hope and change, the reality for many Black Americans remained bleak. Structural inequalities entrenched in the economic system continued to perpetuate poverty and hindered upward mobility for people of color. Moreover, the housing crisis hit Black communities particularly hard, further widening the wealth gap. Predatory lending practices targeted Black homeowners, leading to disproportionate foreclosures and loss of generational wealth. The housing market collapse left many Black families without homes and stripped away their financial stability, deepening the economic divide between Black and white Americans. As frustrations mounted within the Black community, calls for systemic change grew louder. Activists and grassroots organizations pushed for policies aimed at addressing racial disparities in wealth, employment, and housing. They called for investment in underserved communities, targeted job creation initiatives, and measures to combat institutionalized racism within financial institutions. However, despite these efforts, progress was slow, and the economic struggles of the Black community persisted. Structural barriers rooted in centuries of systemic racism proved difficult to dismantle, and political gridlock hindered meaningful reform. The promise of economic prosperity remained elusive for many Black Americans, leaving them disillusioned with the political establishment and skeptical of promises made by politicians. But perhaps the ultimate betrayal came towards the end of his presidency, when he had the opportunity to make a lasting impact and take a bold stand for Black people. In his last year in office, he had the chance to appoint a Supreme Court justice to replace the late Antonin Scalia, which would have shifted the balance of the court in favor of progressive values. But instead, he chose not to nominate a Black woman, despite the fact that many were qualified for the position. It was a missed opportunity to make real progress towards representation and diversity in the highest court of the land. In the end, I couldn't help but feel disappointed and let down by Obama's presidency. As a young Black man, I had hoped that his election would be a turning point for our community, a step towards achieving true equality. But instead, I saw how he prioritized the interests of the wealthy and maintained the status quo, ultimately betraying the very people who had put their trust and hopes in him. But despite his failure and betrayal, I believe that the fight for equality and justice for Black people will continue. We must learn from this experience and hold our leaders accountable. And most importantly, we must never lose hope that one day we will have a leader who truly represents and fights for the rights and needs of the Black community.